So the Mexican-American War opened up a whole section of the country that had not been available before, and so this is going to bring the whole issue about slavery and and how to develop this Western territory. This is going to be a hot button issue. It's a great concept, certainly according to kind of this American ideal, this blending of the Jefferson idealism, and kind of that, independence, freedom, individualism concept, that really seems to be driving a lot of American expansion. But what we're going to find out is that it ends up kind of creating conflict, or at least areas of conflict. The Western territories have been, migration is an important factor. Now, you have migration and immigration. Immigration is coming into the country from somewhere else. Migration is moving within a particular area. So this Western migration is really about seeking opportunity, seeking money, seeking a lifestyle. The market economy is starting to make people feel like maybe they don't have a say. Maybe they're not the system isn't working in their favor. And so you're going to have really a couple of phases. The first phase, until about the 1840s, you have people moving westward without government consent. They're just kind of doing this on their own. This is going to be the Mormons of Utah, some of the early trails that are going into California. And then you're going to begin to have this concept of manifest destiny. And it's going to kind of start to, in the 1840s, capture people's imagination that somehow we're entitled to all that land. Now, understand that Mexico controlled part of it. The Louisiana Purchase did not include all of the continental United States. And yet people really began to grasp onto this notion that we should go from coast to coast. And what you're going to see is that the government supports this idea. And it's aided by the concept of our Anglo-American superiority. So and it's not as simple to say as that it's white superiority, although whiteness is a component of it. It's really about the fact that somehow being American, being kind of that Western European background, somehow makes you more predisposed to conquering the territory, makes you more likely to utilize the land. That somehow what you bring to that part of the country is superior than what, say, the Californios can have or the Native Americans can have. And so this is going to justify to a lot of people that are frustrated with the market economy, don't feel like they have enough opportunity. And so you're going to have lots of people, the gold mine, the 49ers, 1849, when they discover gold in California, that's going to be a big factor in kind of drawing people westward. On top of the farmland. And keep in mind that life in the West is very difficult. And not just everybody moves out there. In other words, that the act, and we kind of talked about this when we talked about the colonies and what made people move westward and move to a new world, it takes a unique mindset of wanting to have independence, wanting to control your own destiny. So the same qualities that we see that drew people into North America are going to be the same qualities that pull people west to, the Western territories. And keep in mind, too, it's not just miners, it's not just men, it's women, too, and these women are unique, they're tough thinkers. You also have a number of Chinese. By the time you get to the 1850s, Chinese have been immigrating into the United States. Thanks to lack of opportunity, starvation in China, a malfunctioning government. So you're going to see that you kind of have this very diverse group of people in the Western Territory that have the commonality of having that kind of risk-taking kind of attitude. And this is going to put Native Americans on the Plains area under a great deal of pressure. Now, understand that Jackson, of course, had moved the Cherokee and some of those eastern tribes to the Oklahoma Territory, saying, oh, it'll be great, it'll be perfect. Now you've got Americans kind of spilling over, kind of going around Oklahoma, if you will, which, if you remember from the role play, was kind of an idea that had been floated about going around in Georgia. Of course, the big difference being that Georgia was perfect for cotton production, whereas, Utah and New Mexico is not good for cotton production. But these Plains Indians are going to begin to really notice the change by the time you get to 1850. Now, the situation with the Plains Indians won't really bubble up until you start to get to the Civil War and right after. But understand that now they're the ones that are starting to come under that same kind of expansion pressure that we saw the other ones. This is a famous painting representing Manifest Destiny. And you can see the Indians here being driven out, the buffalo. Here's the farmers, the miners, pushing out wilderness, pushing out, savagery, bringing civilization. Here is progress right here. The stagecoach, the railroad, telegraph line, all that kind of stuff, embodying everything. Here's the coast, the eastern side. So the kind of that picture of what Manifest Destiny means and what it meant to the Americans at the time. So Americans at the time are going to see this very much in a pro-white kind of viewpoint. And so that's going to really kind of shape how they look at things. So 1848, James Polk is running. Democrats are beginning to be divided. Van Buren, who of course worked with Jackson, he actually creates a wing called the Free Soil Party. These are Democrats that are kind of balanced on the market economy and resist the idea of expanding slave territory because they see expanding slave territory as being unfair. That slave owners are going to be able to buy up and use more land than than say your average ordinary farmer that can't afford to do that. And so the Democrats are going to buy into Van Buren, Van Buren's going to split the Democratic Party with the Free Soilers. Zachary Taylor is going to be nominated by the Whigs. And of course, Polk is kind of favoring this idea of, kind of that pro-slavery aspect. So this is kind of why that's, the Free Soilers are such a big impact. Zachary Taylor, rough and ready. Of course, he was a general that had successfully completed the Mexican-American War. The Whigs kind of, paint him as pro-market, pro-stability. And so the Democratic Party is going to be split. This is what we call a third-party effect. We talk about this frequently in the course of American history. Whenever you have that third party, they're going to siphon votes away from somebody, and you're not going to have a true majority. Well, what does that mean? That means that the country is not going to be in agreement about what the next step is. You're going to have a lack of unity over what the country should be doing. So you're going to see that you start to have these questions about California coming into the country. Should California, come in as a free state? If it comes in as a free state, what are we going to do? Is there a comparable slave state that can come in? So lots of kind of debates. In fact, Taylor was facing kind of a resistance, if you will. You had a number of people in the southern states that were kind of angry that he wanted California to come in as a state. Now, understand that California had briefly attempted its own republic. Now, very quickly, it gets annexed by the United States as a territory. So it doesn't quite have the same. This happens like in 46 or whatever. So it doesn't have quite the same trajectory as Texas, but it's very clearly not a slave state. They don't have to be. They have, Californios that are still there. They have they have indigenous people, so they don't need slaves. And so you begin to have these questions about how do we admit California. That's going to lead us into the Compromise of 1850. Zachary Taylor's going to die partway through the term, and Millard Fillmore is going to replace him. This is where we get into this period of the 1840s and 1850s, really kind of the presidents that nobody remembers, these presidents that aren't particularly notable for anything. Taylor could have been a better president if he hadn't died, in the sense that he was certainly ready to fight for California to come in on its own, which would have permanently tilted kind of the balance of power. Other factors about Western migration, trails encourage people to move, so the existence of all these different trails are incredibly important to begin to kind of create these precursors to roadways, the facilitating of transportation, which we'll talk about when we talk about railroads, which we'll talk about when we look at steamships, or not steamships, but automobiles and that kind of thing. The California Gold Rush, just remember that you have kind of this attempt at kind of gaining revolution, and they're going to very quickly get pulled into the United States orbit. And then, of course, the discovery of gold and the influx of the Chinese. In California, there's going to be a very strong anti-Chinese sentiment, this kind of idea of nativism, this preference for American-born, read white American male-born. And you have that happening in the East against the Irish and against the Catholics, especially around the cities. But in the West, it's going to be primarily against the Chinese. And so this is going to be pretty awful. This will ultimately lead to a Chinese Exclusion Act, which we'll talk about in the second semester. So in the West, because of the Mexican-American War, we have gained we have gained more states. So the Louisiana Purchase gave us 5 states, with the slave states of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, with free states, Indiana, Illinois. So we have a balance in Congress with the Louisiana Purchase. But because of this expansion, right, we have this whole question about California coming in as a free state. And Missouri wants to be a slave state. This is how we come up with this Compromise of 1820, that 3630 line. And so the idea that California, has part of its territory underneath that 3630 line is part of where the dilemma comes in, right? And so this is a huge question. So how do we let California enter the Union? This is going to take us into the Compromise of 1850. So Zachary Taylor had basically threatened the Southern secessionists who are looking at the Missouri Compromise, looking at the balance of power that has been perpetuated by the Compromise of 1820. And they say, well, wait a minute, California should be broken up into 2 states, right? Because part of it's beneath that 3630 line, part of it's above it. So this is the answer. And Taylor's like, no, California doesn't want to do that. And so basically Taylor is kind of threatening to strong arm the Southerners. And Henry Clay and some other senators will work for a solution. And basically what they're going to do is they're going to say that Texas gives up some land to go to, I believe, New Mexico. And that land, they'll get paid for it. That lets them resolve the last of their debt from Mexico. They'll take the territories of New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and Arizona. And those 4 territories are formed without any reference to slavery. So slavery is like an undetermined factor for them. Ultimately, they're going to decide that they can decide for themselves. Now, keep in mind, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, Arizona are not places where you would think slave labor would be particularly relevant. In addition, they have large Native American populations and Mexican American or Mexican populations. So I'm sure they weren't particularly concerned about slavery there. They agreed to abolish the slave trade in D.C., but they do not abolish slavery. So Washington, D.C. cannot have slave trade anymore. This is why in Solomon Northup, they are still allowed to do that because Northup's story begins before the Compromise of 1850. And he does a pretty good job of kind of pointing out the irony of Washington, D.C. having slave trade, right? It looks bad. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So this is why this is a win for abolitionists. So California will come in as a free state. You're going to have this Fugitive Slave Act established. This is the concession to the Southerners. And this is a whole new way of looking at fugitive slaves. Basically, it's going to require citizens to assist in capturing fugitives, or they can be fined. So basically, the sheriff could come up to you and say, hey, I need your help. You need to come help me capture this person, whether or not you agree with it, whether or not you ethically support slavery. There's no jury trial to determine if somebody is indeed a runaway slave. There's a special commission that is appointed to make this determination. And guess what? If this commission determines somebody is set free, they get $5. But if they determine somebody should go back down south, they're going to get $10. Gee, I don't know. Do you think that's going to create a problem? So in other words, the special commission will get more money by sending people down south than they will by setting them free. Creates the process easier, creates more officials. So this Fugitive Slave Act is certainly really takes the idea of individual will, of states' rights, and really turns it on its head. So for northern states that don't like slavery, that have a large number of abolitionists and or Quakers and that kind of thing, they're going to be pretty upset about the Fugitive Slave Act. Yes, abolishing the slave trade in D.C. sounds good, but there's still plenty of slave trading going on elsewhere. Um, and so you're just going to see that the Compromise of 1850 is really not going to make anybody happy. Okay, the Compromise of 1850 is going to be a big source of frustration. It's going to cause fear in many African Americans. You're going to see a lot of African Americans flee the northern states to go to Canada because the implications of the Fugitive Slave Act are that anyone can just grab you and claim that you belong to them. And so this is where you begin to see an increase in kidnapping. And you know, a lot of the more famous African Americans will be targeted. And so we'll talk about the concept of defensive slavery here over the next couple weeks. But you'll find it interesting to put the Fugitive Slave Act within kind of this conception of you know, defending slavery as being a necessary thing, being something that people should accept. The Underground Railroad becomes increasingly active during the Compromise of after the Compromise of 1850 to really kind of get people out of there. Because the Compromise of 1850 is so awful, because of this Fugitive Slave Act, people are no longer going to be able to sit on the sides, right? It's just so clearly a violation of the federal government, of what the Founding Fathers intended for slavery. And remember, this is all a compromise in order to get California to come in as a state. And this, you know, and so many abolitionists are going to be extremely upset about this particular law. And the Compromise of 1850 will, I guess, get us through the hump of 1850 and California coming in as a free state. It'll get us through that, but you actually have the beginning of these compromises that really don't do any good whatsoever. Continue to create more and more problems. So Fillmore is not he's not really a good president. The Whig Party is struggling to hold itself together. Taylor is kind of the last strong president of the Whigs, and of course with him dying, you know. And again, lack of leadership, the issue of slavery and what to do about it, how to handle it, how much government do we want to use, and that sort of thing. This is what the problem is. So we'll be talking more in class about the Compromise of 1850. So anyway, so I'm going to stop this here, and then we'll wrap up with